Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to a new exciting podcast I'm premiering today. It is the FCPA Compliance Report International Edition. With the globalization of compliance, both in terms of investigations, enforcement, and most importantly, with the doing or operationalization of compliance, I thought it would be an appropriate time to begin to talk to international compliance specialists. Today, for my first guest, I have a good friend of my seminal podcast, the FCPA Compliance Report, Carlos Ayers. Carlos is a partner at Medea, Ayers and Sarubi in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Carlos and I discussed the recent development in Latin America stemming from the Odebrecht scandal, where federal prosecutors in Brazil and 10 other countries recently announced they had agreed to cooperate in ongoing investigations surrounding not only Odebrecht, but other companies which are alleged to have engaged in bribery and corruption in Latin America. We also take a look at the increasing use or incorporation of compliance into Brazilian companies and what that means for doing compliance going forward. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to the inaugural episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, the International Edition. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to the first international edition of the FCPA Compliance Report. I can't think of a better person to have on for the first international edition than Carlos Ayers, a founding partner at Medea, Ayers and Sarubi, a law firm in Sao Paulo. Carlos, a longtime, many-time guest on this podcast previously, and has graciously agreed to join us. So, Carlos, welcome.
Hi, Tom. It's a pleasure to participate on this podcast. Thank you for inviting me.
Carlos, we've had some really interesting news come out of both Latin America and Brazil specifically. And so I wanted to see if you could maybe enlighten some of the listeners in North America. And I'd like to start with the South American continent-wide task force on anti-corruption. It seems to be prosecutors from most countries in Latin America South America have gotten together and agreed to jointly investigate and perhaps even prosecute bribery and corruption, and I was just wondering if you could flesh it out and give us a little more details.
Sure. The federal prosecutors from 11 countries met in Brasilia on February 16 this year to discuss international cooperation in connection to investigations involving possible wrongdoing related to Odebrecht and its employees. So the countries that participated in that meeting was Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Panama, Peru, Portugal, the Dominican Republic, and Venezuela. So the idea was to create an international task force to investigate and prosecute Odebrecht and its employees. It's unclear what the impact of this task force will be, but just in the context of the car wash operation and based on information provided by the federal prosecutors, as of February 23, 2017, there had been 131 requests for international cooperation in the context of the car wash operation. 103 of those requests were sent by Brazil to 31 countries, and Brazil also received 21 requests from 15 countries for cooperation. So I think this new task force helps the prosecutors when they get together to share information. And I also think these meetings, in addition to serve as a forum for the prosecutors to interact, the prosecutors learn from each other. So I think the Brazilian prosecutors, they are very sophisticated, and some of that sophistication, I think, also is related to the experience shared among the different authorities. So one should expect the same level of questions that the DOJ and SEC make, for example, when they evaluate an internal investigation in the U.S. So questions like when the conduct was discovered, what was done to reduce risks, what was done to preserve documents, when documents were preserved, what is the methodology of the investigation. These are questions that the Brazilian authorities are making to the companies that are interacting with them. And I think these should be also expected in some extent in these other countries as well. With respect to the Odebrecht, 78 executives related to Odebrecht and Braskem, they signed plea agreements. And early this week, the chief prosecutor in Brazil asked the Supreme Court to start around 80 investigations in connections to politicians and other hundreds of investigations related to non-politicians. So the Brazilian authorities do have some information about conduct that took place overseas. So we should expect to see enforcement actions in these other countries as well. So to finalize on the car wash has been very active for some time and will continue to be as these new cooperation statements are going to become public very soon in the coming days. So more investigations are going to continue to be done, but we should see how that will develop, because I believe that the pace might slow down a little bit, especially because many of these cases are being handled by superior courts, which are the courts that, as a general proposition, they have jurisdiction to investigate politicians, and they do not move as fast as the federal district court in Curitiba. But this is an interesting development to see all these authorities working together, meeting together, and once they meet, that also helps sharing of information.
So, Carlos, the second thing that I wanted to visit with you about, I really find that it ties into the first, but specifically, there's been a fair amount of publicity in the United States about Brazilian companies moving to create or enhance corporate compliance programs, sometimes for the first time, sometimes upgrades, really starting with Petrobras at the top, but it's moved far beyond simply Petrobras. Are you seeing that development in from your clients or any of the folks that you work with?
Yes, Tom, I think that's a fair statement. That's a movement that started some years ago and were driven initially by companies that were subjected to the FCPA. So it was very common for them, especially in pharmaceutical and IT industry, to require their distributors to have a compliance program as a condition for them to do business with these multinationals. So then in 2013, Brazil passed the Clean Companies Act, which is a very harsh law with severe sanctions like fine up to 20% of the gross revenue, suspension of activities, prohibition to receive incentives. And for the first time, the law in Brazil gave credit for companies that have an anti-corruption compliance program, because before that, even if a company had a state-of-art compliance program, the company would get no credit for it. So as a result of this new law and a strong enforcement, we saw an increase in companies implementing their compliance programs in Brazil or updating their program. And other countries follow it, like Colombia and Peru. They passed new legislation, and the new legislation also address the compliance program. So this strong enforcement and the new law were also drives for companies to create and increase their compliance program. And it's interesting because the other day I was reading an article in a well-known newspaper in Brazil that says that compliance these days has become a tool for companies to retain talents. And the article was saying that the difficulties that many of the employees that work in companies that were implicated in the car wash are having to find new jobs, and many of these companies are divesting. So that's an interesting aspect, and compliance has been something that is on the news oftentimes. And you mentioned, and this is public information, that Petrobras now requires its vendors to have a compliance program as a condition to do business with them. So compliance is not even more a business advantage. It's really a need to have for many companies in Brazil to do business. And I think here it's important also to address that, especially for multinationals enhancing their local programs, is that the scope of the local laws is broader than corruption. So the law in Brazil covers also fraud in public procurement, even if it's not related to corruption. And there is a very thin line of what can and cannot be done in the context of public procurement. So the office of the Comptroller General in Brazil, CGU, which is now the Ministry of Transparency, issue guidance in which they highlight this aspect of the scope of the local law, and they give guidance in terms of the compliance program. And this material is also available in English. Another aspect is for the companies doing business in Brazil, that they need to tropicalize their program. And I think here I often see examples in trainings in which the example is that, somebody took a client to play golf, but nobody really plays golf in Brazil. So, and the focus end up being a lot of on the FCPA. Of course, it's important to talk about the FCPA if a company is subject to it, but the local enforcement is very strong. So when you highlight also the local enforcement, the local case, then it becomes more tangible. Another example is audit rights that often do not work and courts are not used to it. So companies need to pay attention otherwise and have good clause, otherwise enforcement, and the enforcing such clause can be expensive and time consuming. But overall, I would say that we are where US was like 10 years ago in terms of anti-corruption, but I think we are moving in the right direction, and we are moving very fast.
So one of the things that intrigued me, we have talked about it a little bit in a prior podcast, though, is that with this continent-wide agreement between prosecutors to both investigate and perhaps enforce, I would think that companies that have done business in any of those countries would now need to really take a look at their business connections, their third parties, and any issues with a much wider variety of companies than simply Odebrecht, which we did talk about before. And I see the business response in Brazil that you've just articulated for us, Carlos, as really the first step in what might be a continent-wide approach to a business solution to the issue of, or the legal, the laws coming into force, preventing bribery and corruption. So I'm really intrigued to see or understand if you see your clients really understanding that this is now a South American issue in terms of what they need to do to be prepared for an investigation.
I think so, Ton, and you touch a very important point, because a lot has been said about Odebrecht and their settlement in the U.S., specifically mention different countries. But if we look at the construction companies that were involved in wrongdoing in Brazil, they also do have business in Latin America, in many countries, in Africa and elsewhere. So if they were doing this here, it's possible that they were doing this elsewhere. So I think it's important for companies to look on the business in other jurisdictions with these entities as well. So that's an important development, and it's important to pay attention to what these companies were doing in other countries as well.
Carlos, you also recently spoke here in the United States, and I think it was to Georgetown Law School.
Yes, I gave a presentation
Could you tell us about
2 weeks ago.
Sure.
It was a very interesting experience. One of my former students of compliance course that I teach here in São Paulo, she's now an LLM student at Georgetown, and she invited me to talk to the LLMs about the scenario that of anti-corruption scenario in Brazil, what makes the car wash operation so successful, and what we should expect. And I was very surprised because it was a really packed session, a lot of people, and interestingly, there were many people from countries in which Brazilian companies are alleged to have paid bribes in the context of the car wash. So that drove a lot of attention. One topic that we discussed a lot was about whether or not the double jeopardy clause would apply. And we discussed that a lot. And one thing to take into consideration in that regard is that we have conducts that took place in different countries, right? So if we look, for example, at the Odebrecht settlement, part of the conduct took place in the U.S., where meetings in which unlawful conducts were discussed according to the settlement agreements, and also the New York banks were used to pay bribes. So it's not really a double jeopardy. The double jeopardy clause would not apply because there were conducts that took in different countries. So it was a very interesting section and very interactive with the Georgetown LLM students.
So, Carlos, how is the new firm coming along?
Well, it has been very good. We put together a new firm with a boutique format, and we are doing compliance work, internal investigations, government enforcement, case litigation in that context, and a lot of pre-acquisition due diligence. Many of the Brazilian companies are divesting. Some of them are mentioned in different enforcement actions. And this has been something that we have been very busy for the last couple of weeks. And I'm enjoying. I'm having a good time, and the work has been good. It's a good moment to do compliance work in Brazil, and I think the country is moving in the right direction.
Well, that's certainly good news. I think on all fronts. I think you're right. It is a fantastic moment for Brazil in the realm of anti-corruption, and you're well suited to be a part of that going forward. Unfortunately, we're there near the end of our time, Carlos, but I was wondering if anyone wanted to email you. Could you give out your email address?
Sure, absolutely. It's carlos.iris at maedaires.com.
Well, Carlos, I really look forward to having continuing reports for the FCPA Compliance Report International Edition from you and Brazil. And thank you very much for taking the time to visit with myself and my listeners. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you again for listening to the inaugural edition of the FCPA Compliance Report, the International Edition. If you've listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate us, as it would help our rankings and, more importantly, spread the word about this new exciting and solo podcast on compliance from the international perspective. Also, if you have any questions, please email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to the FCPA Compliance Report, the International Edition.